broke. That's a kind of a simple way to think about it. Where how that plays out will take years, but that's a good place to start in terms of understanding it. Where did this come from? Well, runaway deficit spending. I'm not talking about the last 2 years, the last 10 years. This has really been building over 50 years. By the way, I don't think of this as a recession or a past recession or even a panic, although clearly there was a panic in 2008. To me, the best way to understand it is to understand that we're in a depression. If you go back to the Great Depression, 1934 was one of the best years in the stock market ever prior to 2010. So there's 2009 and 2010. So there's nothing inconsistent about declining unemployment, rising stock markets, rising commodity prices in the middle of a depression. And that's just kind of my frame for understanding it. So we have baseline deficit spending. We have enormous additional fiscal stimulus. By the way, the best science is that stimulus is one of the great misnomers. I don't call it stimulus, I just call it spending. Stimulus does not stimulate anything. And there's been an enormous amount of work on the so-called Keynesian multiplier, which now looks to be a fraction, maybe somewhere between 0.6 and 0.8 at best, and sometimes as low as 0. And the theory there was if you spend $1 trillion, you get 1.5 trillion of added GDP. Bearing in mind, to spend $1 trillion, you've got to take it from the private sector because there's no place else to get it, which means that stimulus spending destroys wealth, which is feels a lot more intuitively correct. So you take $1 from the private sector, you run it through the government, it's kind of intuitive that you're going to get less at the other end. It doesn't mean zero, but the idea that that process destroys wealth makes good intuitive sense, and the science seems to bear that out. So we're not getting anything for a stimulus. And then finally, we've had a massive, massive substitution of public debt for private debt. So let's use Ireland as a kind of a petri dish. So the Irish banks go broke, right? They go broke because they were dopes. So the Irish government bails them out. So suddenly the banks are still standing, but now the Irish government has taken on the debt. Well, now the Irish government's broke. So who's bailing them out? Well, they're being bailed out by a consortium of the European Central Bank. They have a special stabilization fund, and the IMF. All right, so Irish government lifts the bank debt. IMF lifts the Irish government debt. Who supports the IMF? The United States. I mean, there are other countries, but the United States is a big backer of the IMF. All this comes back to the Fed at the end of the day. The Fed is just like the earth source of all the, I won't call it wealth, but I will call it currency in the world. And this has been going on all over the place, from AIG and Bear Stearns, and you know all the names. I don't need to go through them. But my point is, all we did is by bailing out the private system, we didn't solve a problem. We didn't write off the debt. We didn't make it go away. All we did was move it from one bucket to another, from a private bucket to a government bucket. So this has exacerbated the sovereign debt crisis that I described. So this is kind of where we are. Now, how do you get out of it? How do you repay the debt? Well, the traditional way was you would grow the economy and impose a certain level of taxes, and through an expanding pie and collecting taxes, you'd sort of defease the debt. But we've crossed the threshold. We've crossed the tipping point. We can't do that anymore. There's no combination of growth and taxes that can defease or pay off the size of the liability. Because our economy is not growing, we're kind of doing 2%, which is not even enough to create enough jobs for all the people entering the workforce, let alone reduce the 8 million unemployed. Apart from that, if you dial up taxes, and again, I'm not trying to make a policy argument pro or anti any of these things. To me, this is beyond ideology. It's beyond politics. This is just math. My point is, if you dial up the taxes, whatever you think of that, you're going to depress the growth. And so this first slide is just these show countries, and these debt levels are as a percentage of GDP. So, for example, let's take the United States. That's about 300% of GDP. Our GDP is 14 trillion approximately, so 3 times that. We have 42 trillion in debt. This is public-private business debt combined. Why do that? Well, the thing is, you have to look at the private sector debt. You have to look at individual debt. If I owe a lot of money and I have to pay it back, well, in the course of paying it back, I'm not spending it, am I? And so it's that deleveraging, it's that paying off the debt that from the individual up to the government level, except the government's not, that is depressing spending. So you can't, with the deleveraging, you don't get the consumption. Without the consumption, you don't get the growth, you don't get the taxes. You just cannot get there from here. By the way, that 42 trillion, 3 times 14, is grossly understated, because that's only like debt where you actually borrowed it and signed a note and issued some liability. If you throw on contingent liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, student loans, FHA, Federal Home Loan Bank System. I could keep going, but you get the point. Throw all that in, the number is in excess of $100 trillion. I said before that this debt is not going to be repaid. It cannot be repaid. So how do you get out of that? There are actually several classic ways of defaulting, and let's put default in quotation marks. There's the outright default, so I'm just not going to pay you, right? That would probably happen in a deflationary collapse, where the economy, we're back to the Great Depression, and people just don't pay. And that is what happened in the Great Depression. The great debt crisis of the 20s and 30s had to do with World War I reparations imposed on Germany. Germany owed the money to Britain and France in reparations, totally unpayable. There was no way Germany ever could have repaid that. But France and England had war debts to the United States. We funded them regularly by buying their bonds. They then imposed that debt on Germany by way of reparations. So Germany couldn't pay Britain and France. Without the reparations, Britain and France could not pay the United States. In the deflationary collapse of the 1930s, that debt was not repaid. President Hoover issued a moratorium on war debts in 1929, but as a quid pro quo, he insisted that the British and French put a moratorium on reparations as well, and then that was sort of buying time. At the end of the day, none of that debt was repaid. So there's your deflationary collapse where you just don't pay. The other way out is confiscatory taxation. So I pay you, but I'm the government, so here's your money, but there's a 90% tax. Give it back. Thank you very much. Third way out is an inflationary default, a hyperinflation. So I owe you $1 trillion. Here's your trillion. Good luck buying a loaf of bread, because I printed all the money. Just print the money and give it to you, and it's not worth anything, but I paid you back, right? So deflation, confiscatory taxation, and hyperinflation are three ways out. So when I said it won't be repaid, I mean that in real terms. In nominal terms, it may be repaid in greatly debased currency, and that's what we should expect.
Before we continue, help us clicking that YouTube like button and subscribe now to our channel. This shows the algorithm that you valued this information, and it helps us spread that message. Sharing is caring. And now, let's continue.
I'm a big fan of Neil Young, and somebody once criticized Neil Young and said, all your songs sound alike. And Neil Young turned around and said, well, it's all one song. When you think about the debt crisis, you look at Dubai, you look at Greece, you look at Ireland, you're like, these have similar characteristics. And my message tonight is, it's all one crisis. This is a global sovereign debt crisis. Nobody can pay. It's just a matter of time before all those chips fall. We'll see how that plays out. So what happens in the short run? What happens while we're waiting for this scenario to play out? The answer is you have currency wars, and a currency war has broken out. When the pie is expanding, when the economy is growing, people don't worry too much about trade advantage. They're like, hey, you got a little edge on me, or I think you're being a little, sketchy with your exchange rate, but it's okay because I'm making enough money, my people are happy. The pie's growing, it's fine, even though I don't like it. But when the pie's shrinking, people fight over crumbs because there's not enough to go around, particularly with a debt overhang. And so it's in precisely these deflationary, declining growth scenarios where the currency wars break out, because that's the way to get an edge on your opponent. You all learned this in your first week of macroeconomics, but definition of GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, exports minus imports. And that's all there is. I mean, it's a tautology, it's a definition, but that's it. Now, the problem today is that consumption is flat or declining because of the personal deleveraging I described. Investment, a little pickup last year, but that's starting to flatten out a little bit, because think of it, you're a businessman. Are you going to invest in plant and equipment when the end user isn't buying your stuff? Probably not. So this is where your currency wars break out, because when C, I, and G aren't doing it for you, you go to net exports. Net exports is the only thing that can drive an economy when consumption, investment, and government spending are not doing it. And how do you get your exports up? You debase, you cut your currency, you devalue your currency. And this is why currency wars, beggar thy neighbor, devaluations break out in times of economic stagnation, because that's the only way I can get an edge. The problem, of course, is that everyone's trying to cut against everyone else all at the same time, and it cannot be done. We can't devalue against Mars. So when net exports are the only source of growth, that's when currency wars begin. Here's a couple things. Think of it in strategic terms, maybe tactical terms, actually. All advantage is temporary. So I devalue against you, but next week you devalue against me, and so whatever edge I got, it goes away pretty quickly. Escalation is inevitable because it is a zero or negative sum game, and so the only way to get an edge is to do more of it. I say escalation is inevitable. I'm reminded of President Eisenhower's comment that if you can't solve a problem, enlarge the problem, make the problem bigger. He meant it in a positive sense of getting a bigger scope on things, but here it's in the negative sense of just continuing the escalation. Escalation includes capital controls. So you think my currency is undervalued, you want to invest in my economy and buy property in my country, fine, I'm putting up gates. They're not tariffs, they're capital controls. You can't come in. Or if you come into my economy, you can't get out. You're here for a long time. We haven't seen that really since the 70s and the early 80s. They're coming back in a small way. I think that'll get bigger. Currency wars lead very quickly to trade wars. You know what that's about. Gold plays a role. We'll talk some more about that. And then ultimately shooting wars, which is what happened in the 1930s after, when Germany devalued against France and Germany refused to pay reparations to France. France invaded the Ruhr Valley and said, what we lawyers call self-help. They just started stripping the coal and the steel and the fat, literally putting it on railroad cars and sending it back to France. Germany was defenseless, and their Chancellor Hitler said, we ought to rearm, and we know how that played out. So that's how these things go. The political backlash against the bailouts, not just in the United States, but globally, in these sovereign debt bailouts is beginning, and it's getting stronger. And the instructive case is Iceland versus Ireland. Two relatively small economies, both broke. Iceland just outright defaulted. They took the "we're not paying you" solution. Their economy collapsed, unemployment went up, their currency was discredited. They were the outcasts of the world. But guess what? Today, Iceland has one of the highest growth rates of any economy, because the good thing about hitting bottom is you got nowhere to go but up. Their currency is so cheap. Tourism is up, exports are up, employment is growing. Well, the great thing about defaulting on your debt is you default on your debt. You don't have to pay it, and you leave it behind you. Your net worth actually goes up. It becomes your creditor's problem. So that's what Iceland did. Ireland is playing ball. Ireland's in the euro. They're getting a euro bailout. They're bailing out the banks. They're not writing off the debt. Why are the Irish people suffering austerity? Why are their elections being put off so you can pay the bondholders of the banks? Why not just stiff the bondholders, say, you know what, you made a bad investment, sorry, too bad for you, but we're going to spend more money at home and help employment. You're going to be hearing more about that, and you're hearing in this country. So let's flip to quantitative easing. The number one question I get, I talk to people around the world that there's a lot of confusion and people haven't seen an economy play out quite the way it is playing out now. The number one question I get is, are we in for inflation or deflation? Because if you tell me that, tell me the answer to that, then I know what to do. I know what kind of portfolio to construct and how to invest and all that. And the answer is, I don't know. But I do know the following, that all the data of price stability, PPI, CPI, producer price index, consumer price index, PC, price deflator, which is Bernanke's favorite measure of inflation, are all close to zero. They're what economists call well-behaved. But that's a little bit like saying California is geologically stable because it's not shaking right now. What's going on beneath the surface is you have a massive natural deflation, which happens when you get deleveraging and depression. There is policy-induced inflation, which is what's supposed to happen when you print $1 trillion. The inflation and the deflation are like these tectonic plates. They're coming together. It's not shaking right now, but it's unbelievably unstable, and it's going to break. So which way will it break? My view is that one of two things will happen. Either the Fed will get cold feet. There'll just come a time when the criticism is so great, the money printing is so extensive, the program is so unsuccessful, they'll just have to stop, whether it's politically or they actually believe that's the right thing to do. And then the deflation will take over. That's the natural sequence. My concern is that they'll have faith in their capacity to create inflation by money printing, but they'll find that that's a dynamically unstable process, and you'll go very quickly to hyperinflation. That it won't, this notion that you can dial it up to 2%, and if it gets to 2.5%, we'll dial it down a little bit. That may work in the thermostat in your home. It does not work in a complex system. The other thing you can do is you can shift the cost to different losers. In other words, the people who should lose are the banks and the bondholders who financed all this stuff. But instead, you can say, all right, we're going to bail out the bondholders and shift the loss to the taxpayers. The loss is still there, but we've shifted it from a deserving set of players to arguably an undeserving set of players, which are average citizen and taxpayers. I'm not sure politically that that's very stable. These are kind of the only way out, the only way